Welcome classic rock fans to another ranking video, worst to best, and today we're looking at the studio albums of Gentle Giant. Do click like, subscribe, and do check that notification bell, and check some of the links below this video for ways you can support the sterling work done at Classic Album Review. It's always much appreciated. So enough of this flim-flam, let's get started, shall we? Number 11 is Civilian from 1980, their last studio album, and many would argue a bit of a floater for this band to sail away on. The Village Voice described it as bland. Critical and consumer reaction was not good. In fact, I think a lot of stores actually refused to stock this record. The problem with this album is it was too far removed from that classic Gentle Giant sound. Now you'll find there's a kind of a motif in this ranking video wherever this band have deviated too much from that intrinsic sound that they had, that's when it kind of goes tits up for them. They recorded this album in sunny California with famed engineer Jeff Emmerich, hoping he'd sprinkle some magic Abbey Road fairy dust all over it. But alas, it was not to be. The missing pieces were, if I may quote from Gary Steele's wonderful book, by this point the group had expunged much of its tonal and timbral variety by ditching its acoustic instruments and reducing their musical palette down to that of a bog-standard rock band. Civilian is not a bad album. Kerry Minnear very much takes the reins for this one, and the result is a decent musical fusion. His busy notation, new wave sounds and driving tempos make it an intriguing listen. Standout tracks are All Through the Night, Shadows on the Street and Heroes No More, which I believe wasn't actually on the original album. These are solid rock numbers, nevertheless it seemed that the band had kind of lost direction. It was announced that the tour that followed would be their last, and they disbanded. Number 10 is Giant for the Day from 1978. Some critics have suggested all the hallmarks of that classic Gentle Giant sound was somewhat muted on the missing piece. Well, if that's the case, it's certainly AWOL on this album. The band failed to tour the record, which probably didn't help sales a great deal. But before we call them prog turncoats with this record, let's not forget a lot of prog giants, prog behemoths were, seeking more poppier, glossier affectations, shall we say, by the end of the 70s. Probably to sound relevant, but also because of the cultural mauling that was punk. So it was no surprise, really, in retrospect, that Gentle Giant ditched their musical innovations for 4/4 rockers and 5-minute ballads. With that cartoon cutout-like album cover, it fits in with the theme of the title track with its lyrics about trying on a different mask to assume different identities. This is a well-thoroughed theme in art and literature, of course. I think Lady Macbeth says to her husband, "Present like the flower, but be the serpent under it." Let's not forget Billy Joel releases his album The Stranger a year before this one. Gentle Giant trumpets this new makeover from the get-go. The playfulness matches the straightforward, bright sounds of the music found inside. The power pop rock of Words from the Wise and Thank You have some likeable, folky strummed guitar bits, and some nice slide guitar moments as well. Some have said on this album they begin to sound like Neil Young's backing band. Crazy Horse or not, this album lacks any equine grace. It also lacks the sonic jiggery-pokery of the band's classic albums. Kerry Minnear probably went down the pub when they made this one. There are some nice glimmers on this, such as the ensemble singing of the aforementioned Words from the Wise, the instrumental Spooky Boogie, and what can be described as the mature pop complexity of No Stranger. But it didn't attract a new audience and alienated their core audience, who are prog fans that like to touch the hard stuff. The title track from this album was the only track they ever played live, and that was on their last tour. Number 9 is The Missing Piece from 1977, their last album to chart in the USA, if I'm not mistaken. This is an album, of course, where, again, this band were pursuing a more accessible sound to try and woo the casual listener, maybe. But it's a record that I would describe as stylistically befuddled. By 1977, Gentle Giant's complicated music, informed by Baroque and medieval stylings, had won them a solid fan base all over the world. But those phlegmy upstarts, those punks, were pogoing their way across the British Isles, announcing themselves in no uncertain terms. And then we had a young audience that for some reason just couldn't relate to Baroque meditations on power and overt displays of counterpoint that would have J.S. Bach chewing his own wig off. This album saw the band streamline their sound for a more live production, maybe again, as I've said, to woo the more casual listener. But there are glimmers of progness on this. The band's topsy-turvy, contrapunctual arrangements can be excavated from this unconvincing attempt at generic rock. On this album, I do rather like the track For Nobody. It has a bit of punk snarl and prog dexterity to it. But overall, this is an imbalanced album, I think. Number 8 is Interview from 1976. This concept album about the jaded process of performing promotional interviews. It's as if they were deliberately looking for a conceptual conceit to piss off their music press. The album starts with a preamble to a radio interview before launching to one of their more muscular grooves, establishing rather stirringly the thematic thread of this record. It seems that all the band's energies were spent retweaking their sound on this rather than paying any attention to the thematic thread, which is a shame because it could have been a perfect bit of almost postmodern Drosty effect. After the band's surprisingly strong Freehand, they were pressured to rush out another album to fan the flames of commercial success, if you will. This was recorded at a frenetic pace and falls short of their previous albums. Nevertheless, there are typical complex harmonies, intricate musical passages, but the real progress is in the group's expanded sound, thanks in largely to Kerry Minier's stellar keyboard innovations. The reggae-style Give It Back is not one of my favourites. I do like Design, which harkens back to that classic Gentle Giant sound, with its layered counterpoint and associated medieval feel. In contrast, I think, with the aforementioned Give It Back, it's definitely a prime piece of Gentle Giant. However, Clouds and Silver Linings, this album did result in one of the best live albums ever, Playing the Fool. Number 7 is Freehand from 1975, Gentle Giant's first album for Chrysalis Records and a label they would remain with to the end of their career. The band further developed the eclectic nature of their music, those wonderful experimental elements, yet were on this album pursuing a slightly harder, rocking, more accessible sound, I think. Nevertheless, the brilliance of their previous album is apparent on here with the 4-part fugue On Reflection. The band were looking to consolidate their strengths, I think, from the stellar previous album, The Power and the Glory, although many feel the more, shall we say, accessible elements of the band's sound on this album was a serious compromise, sacrificing the band's more unique elements, shall we say. Those elements that distinguished them from their peers. Some have suggested that this is the last of their truly great albums. The band did tour this album, and in the USA they were paired with inappropriate bands whose audience just couldn't quite appreciate the uniqueness of their sound. Subsequently, the band were often booed off the stage. Number 6 is In a Glass House from 1973. Many see this as a transitional album following the departure of elder brother Phil Shulman after the completion of Octopus. Many argue that this fundamentally changes the sound of the band, especially with the absence of horns. It certainly sounds more stripped, I think. This is an album, of course, based on that old aphorism, those that live in glass houses should not throw stones, and it appropriately begins and ends with the sound of broken glass. The Gentle Giant trait of organising their music around strange and jarring time and tempo changes is very much apparent here. However, the uncertainty of their direction following the departure of the aforementioned Phil Shulman seemed to force them to up their game, as if the survival of this band very much needed to be stated. Certainly the musicianship on this album is absolutely top-notch. They create a rather intriguing collection from the nice percussive number that is a Inmate's Lullaby, or the strange otherworldly sort of modern medieval style music with Way of Life. Fans seem to be rather torn regarding this album, some seeing it as a bold new direction, others as merely a stepping stone to their masterpiece, which is The Power and the Glory. Despite its troubled origins, it's still a remarkable piece of gentle giantness. Gary Steele describes it, he writes about this album in his wonderful book. He says, the slightly austere, moody nature of the songs and music casts it into the same timeless cauldron as a contemporaneous King Crimson and Van der Graaf Generator. However, like most of their albums, it's one that demands quite a few listens, I think. Number 5 is Three Friends from 1972. For Gentle Giant's third album, it's an album they produced themselves after parting ways with their producer Tony Visconti, and of course their drummer Martin Smith, who had been with the band since the Simon Dupree and the Big Sound days. Mind you, new drummer Michael Mortimer, he didn't last long either. It's an album that is predominantly instrumental, with some tracks having only brief vocal interludes. It's a varied album. I especially like the almost spriteful, playful first half of School Days. The harmonies and arrangements managed to still explore the band's penchant for medieval atmospheres. And although it's a great album, it doesn't sit that well next to the other hard hitters of 1972, namely Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick, Yes, Close to the Edge, or even the ELP's Trilogy. It's a concept album that explores the relationship between three friends over time and how these relationships diverge. And although not a perfect prog album, it's certainly an intriguing concept, although some critics have levelled criticisms of tweeness at them, as well as overt sentimentality. While this album does take us down some of the stylistic roads established on the previous albums, what is missing here is the darker textures and dissonance that provides the contrast and balance in their music that doesn't seem to be as apparent here. Number 4 is The Power and the Glory from 1974. This album was born out of rather tense relations with their label, who were pressuring the band to record more accessible music. The ornate playing from Kerry and the loudest guitar work from Gary is notable on this one, and welcomed, I have to say. The music hints at the baroque tinges of the previous albums, but it sadly lacks the Phil Schulman horn treatment. Playing the Game and So Sincere considered the most easily digestible numbers and numbers that would feature in the band's live set. It's said that 1974 is quite an odd year for progressive rock, really, a time of changes in many respects. Of course, the major players of the genre drifted towards triple live albums. King Crimson seemed to have vanished up their own aspect, and Tull returned to the standard rock format, I think, with the War Child record. Yes, of course, were minus the Curry King and Gentle Giant, who had never achieved the same level of popularity as the aforementioned, didn't tumble into that kind of absurdity, but instead put out an incendiary album. An album that was as muscular as its predecessor. It's a rather obvious album about the corrupting influence of power. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. In 1974, I think this was the year, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was the year of Watergate. Of course, the Cold War was raging on as well. And the cover art was based on a genuine vintage playing card. If I'm not mistaken, I think the album actually came out with rounded corners, just like the playing card. I mean, how nifty is that? Number 3 is Gentle Giant from 1970. There are those that consider this to be one of the greatest progressive rock debut albums ever, certainly up there with King Crimson's In the Court of the Crimson King, and of course that ELP debut. On this album we get a combination of the youthful abandonment associated with the late 60s, some harder, bluesier feel to some of these tracks, as well as the promise of what is to come later on in terms of the baroque flourishes and jazzy undertones. Kerry Minnear is fantastic on this record, as is Gary Green's guitar work, which is lyrical and always surprising. I enjoy the use of sax and trumpets on here, courtesy of Phil Schulman, which goes some way to explain perhaps why this band started to accrue quite a cult following from the get-go. Undoubtedly, this album does represent the group finding its feet, so to speak, but it's certainly a signpost as the way to the greater albums that would come later on. And despite the fact that their defining musical characteristics were still being thrashed out, it doesn't preclude this album from being an album of note within their discography. Interestingly, this LP was not released in the USA, and just to befuddle you even further, the sleeve for this album was actually put on Three Friends, the USA edition. The standout tracks on this album are Giant, I think. It has a mythic quality. It's analogous with the formation of this band, I believe. It tells the story of the birth of a giant and his ascendancy in the world. It's an explosive intro, and not too dissimilar from a band like Colosseum with its own prog and jazzy fusion. Frank Zappa was a huge influence. I particularly liked his complex horn lines and metric noodling. Funny Ways is another interesting one, delightful, delicate violin intro and troubadour style of vocal. The sound of this one seems to be a band competing with Genesis for the title of Edwardian prog. Number 2 is 1971's Acquiring the Taste. This album certainly builds upon the brilliance of the debut album. It's more mature and more accomplished, I think. It's unfortunate that the arse-licking sleeve tends to overshadow the brilliant music contained therein. Pitchfork voted this album cover as one of the worst ever. Acquiring the Taste is a solid progressive rock album. It's superior singing and playing, songwriting, as well as a more unified sound than what we'd seen from them before. It's a maturing, I think, and it still retains many of those elements that we enjoyed on the debut. The musicianship displays an elegance, and there's a furtive experimentation which very much puts them up there with all their prog peers. And on this album, their interest in early music is apparent. I particularly enjoy Pantagruel's Nativity as it regales us with that medieval era sound that we would associate with what Gary Steele referred to as that myth-encrusted 5th century king. It's obviously referencing the novel by Francois Rabelais, Gargantua and Pantagruel, about two giants. And this song packs so much detail and dynamic shifts into its 6 minutes 15 seconds. It's an absolute delight, and I particularly like the Moog melody on this one. It's absolutely fabulous. And number one is Octopus from 1972. The title of this album was actually coined by Phil Schulman's wife, Roberta, as a pun on Octo Opus. 8 musical works reflecting the album's 8 tracks. And let's not forget the wonderful artwork on this by Roger Dean. Not the dreadful artwork that appeared on the American sleeve, of course. It's incredible how little this album is actually dated when you listen to it, and it's a testimony to its brilliance, I think. I particularly like the advent of Panurge, which was described in one review as riding waves of sonic tentacles as Gary Green's guitar shrieks, bursts around the thundering bass, and occasionally churchy organ. This track is a genuine classic. I think it was included in a part of the medley that the band would perform live. A Cry for Everyone is another triumph and stands well with the other numbers. Twiddly and knotty compositions, including the occasional a cappella knots, the lilting Dog's Life, and Yes Meets Fairport Convention, Raconteur, Troubadour. It's a challenging listen, this album, arguably one of the most challenging, I think, but it's one that yields more and more rewards the more you listen to it. Some have suggested that this album, the music on this album, is a tad cluttered. I just think as they moved more towards medieval textures and Baroque flourishes, it imposed a more timeless aspect upon the music they were creating. And some of that overcrowded feel, some have suggested it's because each band member is playing about 3 instruments, overdubs for the sake of overdubs perhaps. But I rather like its busyness and all the intrusions. It's part of its charm. It's a wonderful example of Gentle Giant maintaining that broad, challenging and integrated styles, drawing heavily upon literature and philosophy. In terms of its literary references, I've already alluded to some. You get Gargantua and Pantagruel, which is referencing Francois Rabelais. A Cry for Everyone is inspired by the work and beliefs of the writer Albert Camus, and the song Knots is inspired by the book Knots by Scottish psychiatrist R.D. Laing. And it's worth noting that the inclusion of John Pugwash Weathers as the new drummer makes a massive contribution to this band's sound. A seasoned musician who facilitates all their tricky metrical changes. His impact on this album cannot be understated, as well as the albums that follow it. Anyway, there you are, that's my ranking of Gentle Giant. If you enjoyed this video, do share it with anyone you think might be interested. Other than that, I'll leave you with my closing salvo, which is hope you're well, staying safe, and most of all, of course, is that you keep listening.